joining us on the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. The significant historical role of the Ivy League and the relevance of showing Division I how athletics can operate is an important topic and one that I'm glad to bring to the podcast today. Our guest is Jeff Orleans, who for 25 years was the conference commissioner for the Ivy League, now retired. He's an attorney by training and an expert in higher education law. I'll let the New York Times tell us a little bit more upon his retirement. In the mid-1980s, the Ivy League was going nowhere fast. The days of leather helmets and Rose Bowl glory were long gone, and the league, which began formal play only in 1956, seemed headed for irrelevance. Ivy football was dropped into Division I AA, now known as the FCS, in 1981. We're beginning to compete for league championships, and the league's central office had no specific function. The presidents of the 8 universities, who had been running the conference by committee outside of their regular duties, decided the league needed an executive director. So in 1984, the presidents hired Jeff Orleans, a bow-tied lawyer whose experience in sports amounted to little more than cheering for his Yale Bulldogs, the Yankees, and really hating the Brooklyn Dodgers. In a resounding display of support, the presidents provided Orleans with a part-time secretary and an electric typewriter. Orleans said, "We had to build the conference literally from scratch. I started by ordering a second typewriter." Indeed, some ways the Ivy League has led college athletics throughout many decades. They have been at the forefront with women athletes who were competing for Ivy League titles in 10 sports by the early 1980s, and other opportunities were continually on the rise. But as you learn from our conversation, Jeff has been more involved in the arc of college sports than almost anybody in the last 30 years. And I started the interview by asking about the Ivy League's history. Talk a little bit about the role that Ivy League athletics has played over the history of the NCAA and the different space it has taken up.
Well, it's a really interesting question, Karen, because there's a long history. And the Ivies helped invent intercollegiate athletics. There were Ivy schools in the room with Teddy Roosevelt when he leaned on them to begin the NCAA. And of course, interestingly enough, that was about violence and injury in football. So some issues stay with us forever. The Ivies, I think, were not very active in the NCAA up until the 80s, especially as their football moved away from what became, big time, what is today CFP football. Starting in the 80s, we became much more active for two reasons. I think one was there were Ivy presidents who were involved in the ACE push in the 80s to bring about presidential governance within the NCAA. And when I became the first full-time executive director in 1984, one of my goals and one of the things the Ivy presidents asked me to do was to be active, to try and advance our values where that was appropriate, to try and reach out to other conferences so that people had a better understanding of who we were, and to just try and be good citizens in the world of intercollegiate athletics. And I think we've done that both in my time and in my successors in Robin Harris's time. We've had lots of Ivy folks who are active on sport committees. The current chair of the Division I Management Council is Grace Calhoun, who's the athletic director at Penn, and the current Division I Student Athlete Advisory Council representative to the Division I board is an Ivy athlete. I can't remember her name, but so we have both of two Ivy representatives, coincidentally, in the Division I board of directors this week. And I know it's been good for us. It's been good for our presidents and our athletic directors to be part of that larger community and to understand the issues that affect everyone else in Division I. And I think we've been good soldiers. We've chaired sport committees. We've helped organize championships. Carolyn Campbell McGovern in my office and now in Robin's office helped begin both the rowing and the women's and the ice hockey championships in Division I in women's athletics. And I think we've also been able to be a voice for the values that we're trying to promote and to help people understand ways to do those things in the Division I context.
Right. And for those who don't know, just briefly explain to them what the role of football is in the Ivy League and then what the roles are of the other sports in the Ivy League.
A great question. Football was what brought the Ivy League together in the late 40s, first as a kind of loose scheduling arrangement, then as a firmer scheduling arrangement. And the core of that agreement was that there would not be athletic financial aid, the idea that you would treat athletes for financial aid purposes just the way any other students were treated. In the early 50s, when football began to grow, when television was invented and television contracts were just beginning. In fact, Penn had, I think, one of the first television contracts. The Ivy presidents decided that they wanted to take a different role for Ivy football than what they saw among other major colleges and universities. And so they created an all-sport league with an agreement in 54 that began competition in 56. And it said, again, there'd be no grants and aid, and there'd be no postseason competition at least in football, and nominally in other sports. Over time, that quickly became that there'd be postseason competition in NCAA competition. At the time, there was no postseason NCAA football at any level. And so our football continues not to be part of the FCS championship and to have a shorter schedule. And the rest of our sports, although we have, in some respects, shorter schedules and less practice time than other sports, do compete in NCAA championships and compete quite successfully. I think the Ivies are somewhere around the 6th or 7th or 8th most competitive conference under the Learfield Cup point system in Division I.
You also have an interesting sport on some of the campuses called sprint football. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sprint football has a very interesting history. It grew up, I guess, in the 30s and 40s or 50s. It was at that point called lightweight football, and that's what it was intended to do, is to provide a football opportunity for Ivy athletes. A number of the Ivy schools still did not enroll women at that point. And so there were a lot of football players on campus, or high school football players, who wanted to keep playing, weren't big enough, among other things, to play at the Ivy varsity or even junior varsity level. And so sprint football was created to provide an opportunity for those competitors. I think there are only 2 or 3 Ivy schools left that still play sprint football. It's been a long time since I've been commissioner.
Right.
And it is, for those competitors, it's a very intense and meaningful experience.
Right. It's not an NCAA sport, but I noticed that the Ivy has a schedule that goes beyond just playing Division I schools. They'll play Division II schools that have sprint football, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, precisely because it's not an NCAA sport. In that
Right.
sense, it's kind of like squash and men's rowing, which are not NCAA sports, and where there's a lot of competition across divisions, especially in squash.
So tell us a little about revenue sharing and generation inside the Ivy League, institutionally and conference-wide.
So a principal tenet of Ivy athletics is that it's not about the money. So Ivy athletics is paid for very substantially by institutional investment, whether that's presidents and financial officers allocating money to invest in athletics, or alumni fund and other alumni groups raising money for athletics. We're not intended to be dependent on outside revenue. And that relates in part to not wanting to do what today would be called revenue scheduling. Basketball games on Wednesday nights across country, football games on Thursday nights, more travel and more scheduling than we would want. And it's partly a sense that we don't want revenue opportunities from the outside to come to favor one school or schools over others. So for example, if the Harvard-Yale game were bid out not as part of the Ivy football package, but as part of independently, and it produced more revenue than, say, the Penn-Princeton game, we would not want that revenue flowing just to Harvard and Yale and advantaging them in that way. And so the money that comes to the Ivy League, some of it is television revenue, not very much, I don't think. The principal revenue comes from the NCAA basketball fund, and that money is divided equally. I think there's a share for the conference office to help defray conference expenses and keep the dues down, and the rest of it, as I understand it, is divided equally, precisely so that athletic success does not become coupled with revenue, and that doesn't ratchet up the goal of athletic success in a different way.
That makes sense. How about things like institutional ticket sales, sponsorships that are made by the institutions? Is that shared across the conference?
No, it's not. Institutional money is institutional money, and it's an important part of every institution's revenue stream. But obviously, we're playing in a different way than FBS football, and although our basketball's been very successful, both men's and women's, in recent years, as for many Division I schools, it's not a huge revenue generator.
And how about things like coaches' salaries, which seem to be so tied into the marketplace that the broader FCS, certainly not FBS, but FCS marketplace, how does the Ivy compete in that space?
Well, I think we compete well. I don't know anything about individual school salaries or school matters, and we didn't talk about them when I was commissioner. I doubt that people talk about them very much today. What I have seen is that we're able to attract good coaches, I think in part because we have good athletes and good students and a good environment. It's a good place to learn to coach. It's in many sports, being a successful Ivy coach gives you the opportunity either to stay and make a career at one or two schools, or to move into the rest of Division I. So I think our schools are viewed as a good place to become a coach, become a head coach. And I think our athletes are viewed as good young men and women to coach, and the communities are viewed as good communities if you're wanting to settle, if you're wanting to raise a family, as good places to live.
Right.
So we're fortunate in having a lot of long-time coaches, and we're fortunate in having a lot of great coaches who get rated at salaries that we're just not going to be able to pay, and more power to them.
Yep. That's what happens at a lot of the quote unquote mid-major conferences, if you will. So shifting, let's talk a little bit about presidential board oversight and the kinds of decisions and discussions you would typically have at a typical meeting. How often do you meet? What would your agenda look like? That type of thing.
Presidents meet twice a year. When I was commissioner, or for most of the time I was commissioner, the NCAA meeting in January, especially, it was still one school, one vote. And so our 9 votes really mattered, and we would spend a lot of time at the fall meeting talking about NCAA legislation. I know there's still a lot of NCAA discussion, especially around these big issues like name, image, likeness. But the Ivy president's focus really is on governing and leading the league. This is a presidentially governed league. And the underlying context, the admission structure, the limits on practice and season length, the way the athlete experience, that's bottom up in the sense that we rely on coaches and students to have views and to make those views known. But it's top down in the sense that the presidents ultimately make those rules and those decisions. Again, I haven't been executive director for a decade, so I don't know how much detail they get into in these days, but I can remember conversations about how many spring practices we would have, and how many spring games we would have in fall sports, which is pretty granular stuff. And the presidents felt, I think rightly so, that showing that they cared and showing that they would pay attention to this detail would set a tone for the athletic directors and the dean's committee, which would have them be careful in in sending proposals up. And I think we've got a system now in which there's a shared sense of what's appropriate, and a sense in which the athletic directors take on that responsibility themselves in terms of trying to make the limits work in the best possible way. So I think it's presently, and was for most of the time I was there, a very healthy relationship. There's an obvious kind of push-pull in one sense, but I think it's a very good relationship. And certainly the ADs and coaches and administrators who have the longest tenures and are most comfortable in the IB system have adopted those values as their own.
Right, right. One of the values that certainly strikes me as being unique amongst the conference is the missed class schedules, and how infrequently students miss classes because of the structure of this. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came to be and whether that was presidentially driven?
Well, it actually, I inherited it. So
Okay.
it came to be long before my time, but the basic principle, as you suggested, is that we want to minimize missed class time. One way to do that is to play league games as much as possible in the winter sports, in basketball and hockey. Play those league games on the weekends, rather than, as many conferences do, to have a midweek conference game. And that allows you to structure your midweek competitions so they involve minimal travel, or at least as small amount of travel as you can have. And then we use what's called a travel partner concept, in which we'll play basketball games Friday and Saturday night. So you might have Penn and Princeton traveling together, and they would play, one would play at Dartmouth and one would play at Harvard, and then they'd reverse that the next night. And so there's a minimal travel between the road games, the same for Dartmouth and Harvard when they come back down. And those are both on the weekend. And so it's an intense weekend, that's for sure. But it clears out space during the week. And we have rules, for example, about which Saturday football games can be Friday night overnights for the team, rather than just saying, well, if you're playing football on Saturday, you're the away team, you can automatically travel on a Friday night. Again, designed to minimize missed class time. And one of the other things these approaches do, as we've realized over time, is they save some money.
Yeah.
And we have very broad programs. We try and provide very broad athletic opportunities. And where you can control a cost like that without harming the student experience or the athletic experience, that's a good thing to do.
One thing that's really been a trend, at least in the last 10 years, is not to play back-to-back games at the big-time schools. They want lots of rest and recovery. So it strikes me that the Ivy League is saying, you know what, we have to put this in perspective with the context about the students being in college, and that we don't have but 7 days in a week. So you've said, you know, it's not that it's not important, rest and recovery, but we believe that the return to the classroom is equally, if not more, important. What do you think about that?
I think it's a really important dilemma, because rest and recovery obviously matter, and sport is just more intense all the time than it was before. So, our sports medicine and trainer departments pay a lot of attention to rest and recovery. I think it's common in basketball for the day off to be Sunday, the mandated day off to be Sunday. We also have an Ivy rule that requires, I think the total when I was commissioner was a total of 49 days off during the season. So that's more than the NCAA weekly day off.
Right.
And it's designed to give people rest and recovery. It's designed to give them time when they really can focus on their academic obligations, on their rehab if they need to. But I know from the conversations that I had with athletic medicine folks and trainers that wanting to make sure that there is adequate rest and recovery, wanting to make sure that the decisions about returning to play are medical decisions and not competitive decisions is important.
Yeah, and it really it really hits home around the end of the semester and finals week. So how do you all manage finals practices and competitions?
Uh, we don't have competition during exams.
Okay.
Um, I think that the rules may still provide that we don't have practice during formal practice during exams. I'm not sure about reading week. Um, Actually, next year, for the first time, all 8 schools will have December exams rather than January exams.
Okay.
And that will make it a little easier to spread out scheduling in January and take a little pressure off some of the December scheduling. But we're very clear that if you're in exams, you should be in exams. So you can concentrate on your exams, and so that you're not only taking the time out for practice, but you're not uh, uh, putting your energy and accumulating that fatigue from practice while you're in exams.
So in NCAA Division One, the typical team sport athlete could practice up to 22 weeks a year. And if an academic calendar is 30 weeks, that means as a player, a lacrosse player at Duke could practice 22 weeks a year with their team. What does that look like in the Ivy League as far as, let's say, a sport like lacrosse?
I would need to go back and look at what our current rules provide, but we try to start uh, practice, fall practice for the spring sports later, and spring practice for the fall sports later. And importantly, we limit the number of second season games, so fall lacrosse, spring soccer. Um, that limits, not that practices aren't intense, but it limits intensity in a certain way. And it limits travel. And we restrict the number of practices. So you don't have the same number of practices off season. Again, there's a balance there that our presidents recognize between minimizing practice and making sure that people are adequately prepared physically. And so that, of course, we've looked at that, especially in football, where we've changed our football regimen to try and spread out a football practice, reduce two-a-days, which makes preseason practice a little longer.
Right.
But reducing the two-a-days and minimizing contact and essentially eliminating tackling in
Yeah.
practice once the season starts is designed to, again, focus on that health and safety part of the athlete's experience.
And that's unusual in the context of NCAA Division One football. Is that correct?
The Ivies were the first to do it. I can't
Yeah.
take credit for that. It is an
Right.
issue that arose after I left, but we were the first to do it. I think we're still in a minority of schools and conferences that do that.
Right. Right. So I mentioned to you earlier about the Ivy's role in the AAU and the fact that they're elite academic institutions. Does the role of the Ivies in those higher education associations have anything to do with athletics, or are they completely separate?
My sense is that they're separate. I've been at ACA, ACE, and AAU and other non-athletic higher ed meetings, and those presidents, when they get together, uh, tend not to talk about athletics. They tend to talk about athletics in the NCAA context. I'm not sure that's a good thing necessarily, but the Ivy presidents' focus is on their meetings and their administration, and the larger institutions simply don't tend to have formal attention to athletics aside from
Right.
whatever goes on over breakfast. Might go on over breakfast.
um, and one of my last question to you is: let's say you have a new president coming into the conference for the first time IB president needs to be brought up to speed. What kinds of things would you bring them up to speed on? What kinds of things would you be wanting to be sure that they understood?
Well, the first thing I did tell presidents is if you look at the compliance reports from your compliance officers, you're going to see uh, uh, a fair number of minor infractions over the course of a year. because if you have 1,000 athletes and 35 sports and a rule book that is thicker than the Internal Revenue Code, you're going to have a number of inadvertent violations. And the one I would talk about most is the 48-hour visit rule when the bus is snowed out and the student has to stay on campus longer than 48 hours so she's safe.
Right.
So I would say, especially to people coming from a major college background, you should not be looking at numbers of violations as such as a bad sign. I think it probably means instead that your coaches are reporting and your compliance people are educating folks about what minor violations mean. Second thing I would say to them is you should understand that these are institutions that treat men's and women's athletics substantially equally. We have a long record of women being active in athletics back to before women's athletics was under the NCAA, AIAW governance, and we've expanded over the years to have very active women coaches and administrators and very successful women athletes. And I think it's important for presidents who may come from institutions where that is not quite as clear to understand that is a value and should be a value, and that if they don't see it being upheld, they should be active about it. And the third thing I would say is that it's important to continue the Ivy presence in the NCAA and to support, whether it's the Ivy office or administrators and coaches at the campus level, to support that kind of involvement, because that's the way we have some influence over the rules that will affect us. But it's also the best way to present the Ivy model as a healthy and viable Division I model, is for people at other institutions to get to know Ivy coaches and administrators and understand the way they work and understand that they too are competitive.
Yeah.
Want to be successful.
And in this environment today where people are saying that the model we currently have at the highest levels is not working and it's broken, it's nice to be presented with alternative ideas that can at least be discussed as to where we go if we continue on this spiral of just outrageous spending and facilities that are built for lavish people and all kinds of things. And maybe the Ivy has some things that are really worth revisiting.
Well, I've found over the years, the FBS world really is a different world, but I certainly found in the rest of Division I that conferences and commissioners and athletic directors and presidents are trying to do just what we're trying to do. They're trying to provide the best balance between the athletic experience and the student experience that they can. And every conference has a different context and a different history. And so maybe the fourth thing I would say to a new president is we think we have good values and we think we do a good job. No one does a perfect job of living up to them. But we should never forget that the conferences and schools against which we compete are also trying to do the right thing. And especially if a president has little athletic background, it can be tempting to think a little more of ourselves than maybe we should. And so I think that's always been part of what I've done and what my successor has done is trying to be very clear that we think we have a good model and that we're trying to be good in doing it, but that we don't think we're special in that sense. And we're not, in that sense, any better than our colleagues who are also trying to do the right thing in other places.
Right, right. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for taking a few minutes out of your day and
very glad to do it.
About the Ivy League and the important role that it's played not only in college sports history, but the important role it plays today in NCAA governance and other issues.
I'm glad to do it, and I just want to repeat, having been out of the league for 10 years, that whatever success we're having now is due to the efforts of lots of other people rather than to me.
Fair enough. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. That was Jeff Orleans, former conference commissioner with the Ivy League and currently of counsel in the law firm Hirschfeld Kramer in Princeton, New Jersey. That's a wrap. Thanks for joining us for another week of thinking about college athletics from the 30,000-foot perspective. In case this is the first time you are joining us, the podcast drops every Thursday morning. You can listen to previous guests and topics on 8 different podcasting platforms, including iTunes and Spotify. Each week, I will strive to give you a deeper understanding of the complexities of higher education and intercollegiate athletics in the 21st century. Please also join me on Forbes.com for additional content and extended analysis. Have a great week.